Welcome to Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder. Barnaby's is one of the leading search engines for art, design, antiques and collectibles from over 3,000 auction houses worldwide. We aim to make the art and auction market more transparent and accessible to everyone, from beginners to collectors and professionals. In today's episode of Barnaby's podcast, Eye of the Beholder, we talk to Gareth Harris, who is Chief Contributing Editor at the Art newspaper and the writer of the successful book called Censored Art Today. Welcome, Gareth.
Hello, good to see you.
So, last year, you published a book, Censored Art Today. Does that mean that is about the very contemporary art scene, or is it also about censored art from the 20th century?
We wanted this book to be different to other publications on censorship. There have been a few publications and surveys of censored art across the centuries, or in the 20th century at least. But I wanted in particular, to try and get as up-to-date as possible with my analysis, because there are so many issues swirling around at the moment around things like the culture wars, about being woke, whatever that means. So I wanted to try and write something that linked to those different issues. And in the past 2 to 3 years, both pre and post-COVID, there have been so many elements to analyse within this field, such as problematic statues. My other chapters in the book look at political censorship in China, Cuba and the Middle East. I also wanted to look at the suppression of LGBTQ plus artists in so-called illiberal democracies. And I was particularly interested in looking at how artists are facing more and more restrictions online through social media, on social media platforms, which is actually becoming a real issue for lots of artists I speak to today. So I wanted this study to be ultra contemporary as such. And it's difficult because as soon as you write a book, it dates instantly. The things I've written already, some of the things I've written already seem perhaps a little outdated. But yeah, I just wanted to try and literally skim the surface, because I think it's important to say that. I'm literally touching the surface, with the publication. The book is a snapshot. The situation changes every day. I'm a journalist. I cover censorship stories on a daily basis. And there are still thousands of artists and curators oppressed worldwide for so many reasons. But yeah, as I say, I've tried.
But how come you choose the topic?
Because I have been working my work at the Art newspaper has informed my research and the book on a professional level. I've seen the issue up close most weeks in the past 15 to 20 years. I started at the Art newspaper in 2004, and I've been reporting on censorship stories ever since. And also, the book is part of a series called Hot Topics. It's co-published by Lund Humphreys and Sotheby's Institute of Art. Other books in the series cover issues such as museums, private museums and art fairs. And I approached the publisher. I thought censorship would be an ideal hot topic for them. And they agreed. And the rest is history, as we say.
So, but what would you say was the most challenging, as the most fascinating aspect when you were writing the book?
I think the most challenging aspect was trying to whittle down the argument to around 30,000 words, which sounds a lot, but not really, because when I thought about the history of censorship and the current debates, it felt really quite daunting. But my publisher helped me structure the chapters. So things came together under various headings, as I've just mentioned: social media algorithms, problematic monuments. And then there was a sort of extra challenge I felt. I had to stay quite measured and balanced throughout the book, making sure I focused on the different contexts in which artists museums and curators face these kind of restrictions, because everyone has an opinion on censorship. It's quite an inflammatory topic. So it's difficult I had to be measured. I had to approach it in a balanced way. Which side of the debate do people want to fall on in the culture war? It's very difficult. But I think the most interesting aspect for me always involves talking to artists who are obviously at the forefront of the censorship debate. I spoke to some fantastic people, such as the Chinese artist and activist Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei is always pithy and pertinent, and he says, in today's situation in a globalized world, the situation is much more complex. He puts forward the theory that large companies are feeding and controlling a mass audience. He said this before, that mainstream media and the entertainment industry in the West are under the influence of corporations and large enterprises, which he calls corporatocracy. That's his term. Quite interesting. And then I spoke to another brilliant artist called Michael Rakowitz. He's a sculptor in Chicago. And we spoke about problematic monuments, whether historic statues should be removed. I'm not sure if that's an issue, worldwide. Well, it is in the UK and the US especially, and Belgium and some European countries. Michael Rakowitz told me that anything beyond the status quo now is a step forward, because history is already edited by putting up these sculptures. I find that very interesting. How do you set a narrative in history? How do you do that? Across every country in the world, people, whoever they may be, people in charge, people in governments, have set a narrative over the centuries with the kind of public monuments they erect. And that's extremely problematic if some of those monuments are offensive to certain sections of society. So in the UK, we've had lots of heated debate. I don't know if you remember, in 2020, I believe, a statue of Edward Colston in Bristol in the west of England was pulled down and thrown into the harbour. He was a slave trader as such, and that caused a huge stir here about the place in society of monuments, what they represent, what those people represent. So yeah, artists have always been the first to comment as well.
But obviously you raised the problem with this, but do you see any solutions? If you understand what I mean with that.
In the sense that people are working through censorship, is that what you mean? Or?
Yeah, well, I mean, like, for that example that you just gave, I mean, obviously that is part of the history. So when they throw that statue in the harbor, they want to, how do you say? I mean, it's impossible to change the history, isn't it? Of course, you don't need to manifest it today, but still it's part of the history, right? So if you censored part of the history once upon a time, you do it in another way today, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's part of the debate. How do you set a new narrative, It's difficult because I suppose the destruction and dismantling of problematic monuments can be viewed through a political prism to a degree. That's what's interesting. Right-wing individuals in the UK have condemned the toppling of centuries-old statues here. I think Boris Johnson once said, "We cannot try to edit or censor our past." But you're right, how to move forward, I'm not always certain, really. The argument around statues is complex because ultimately, do you try to contextualize a monument? Do you give it a bigger text panel? I mean, some people are keen on that approach. I'm not so sure that solves the problem, because if you're part of a minority community and you feel offended by, say, a statue of a slave trader, and you catch it out of the corner of your eye, I don't see how anything is going to make you feel more comfortable. It's quite a difficult one. Lots of people now, or certain culture commentators, are suggesting offensive, if we want to call them that, offensive statues could be put in a museum or a dedicated museum. And that's what happened with the Colston. I think it's been taken off display now, but it was on show in a museum in Bristol for about a year, I think. And it was battered and it was graffitied. It had been pulled out of the harbour. And I found it really interesting because people were queuing around the block to see this statue that was smashed up and spray painted, and it was laying on its side. And I thought, to me, I thought that was a really quite brilliant solution, because you are still seeing the statue, even though it's vandalized, but you're seeing it in a brand new context. Perhaps you're being given more historical context when you saw the piece. I wasn't sure. I don't know what the curators did. So I don't know. There are solutions being brought forward to recontextualize. But of course, people on the other side of the debate would say these statues represented a certain moment in time, certain values, certain principles. Why shouldn't they stand? That's difficult. So perhaps the key is contextualization. I'm not sure.
You were talking about AI and Instagram, internet. Obviously, if you think about it like a free place, a place where anyone can upload their images, their paintings, their art. But you also touch an interesting point here that it's not actually, because all those are run by huge companies, right? So in one way or another, they are censored, even if you don't think so. And then you mentioned China, for example, when the government are censoring through, well, their platforms. But how shall I say, are we talking about the censored art? What is the differences between West and East when you look at censored art?
It's very difficult. I mean, the whole issue about social media and the internet, we can talk about separately, I think. This is quite a tough one because there have been many censorship incidents in the past few decades in the West. You could argue that censorship has increased in the West, meaning the US and Europe, because, as I said at the beginning of the conversation, of a kind of increasingly visceral proliferation of the so-called cancel culture. So, I mean, those wars were raging in the 1980s and 1990s. I'm not saying they were ever really extinguished. I think the most far-reaching culture war of the past half century probably centers on the trial in 1990 when the Cincinnati Contemporary Art Center was taken to court for showing works from Robert Mapplethorpe's ex-portfolio, a 1978 work. And the Cincinnati institution, it launched the Perfect Moment show in April 1990. It really found itself in the spotlight when it took on conservative groups who were fixated with labeling Mapplethorpe's photography or work as pornography. So that's the first kind of big culture war, really. But lately, I suppose you could say in the past few years, in the West, because you were talking about the West, there's been a perfect storm of the pandemic, the advancement of anti-intellectual populist governments. We've had it in the UK, they've had it in the US, and then you've got really important uprisings against discrimination and inequality, such as Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and these have all brought about a kind of reset of perspectives and principles. That's what's different now. So as a result, the divide between woke and anti-woke is not lessening, but it's intensifying, actually. I don't know what you think. I talk in the book about how cancel culture works. But we'd need to specify, I suppose, with the East, where, which part of the East are we talking about with censorship trends? I think in authoritarian states such as China, censorship has always gone hand in hand with governance. But from my understanding, I work with a few Chinese journalists. I gather from various news reports, the threat to free speech there is actually greater than ever, especially for artists. So I was working with a reporter a few months ago on the art newspaper. She reported that with the rise of Xi Jinping, who's the leader of China, there's been an overall ideological tightening in China, not just in the arts, but firstly with the universities, media, and gradually it's affecting contemporary artists. So I think things there are sort of worse than ever. I mean, in the book, I discuss also the situation in Hong Kong, which is really interesting. There was a national security law introduced in Hong Kong in 2020, and that has changed a lot. That means there's been a clampdown on certain sections of society. Many artists have left the country, and the red lines, as we call them, those kind of dividing lines between freedom and non-freedom, are much clearer, much more clearly demarcated now. And I think Hong Kong it's turning into quite a tragic situation there. We'll have to see what happens, but artists are definitely being impacted, and they feel they're being curtailed. I mean, there was a monument there called the Pillar of Shame, which was at Hong Kong University, and it was kind of a tribute to those killed in Tiananmen Square in 1989. And it was by a Danish sculptor called Jens Galchio. It was erected in 1997 at the University of Hong Kong. But it was removed quite recently, actually. Perhaps it was the early last year, I'm not sure. Perhaps I would need to check. Reports said that workmen were seen taking away the top half of it with a crane. And the university said the decision to remove the statue was based on external legal advice, and they also cited safety reasons. But I say in the book that, to my mind, the removal of the Pillar of Shame, as it's called, reflects how political dissent in Hong Kong will sort of no longer be tolerated by the government in Beijing. So it's getting more and more tense there. So that's my analysis, but yeah.
Yeah, and not just Hong Kong, but also China. It seems like it's really a step back, isn't it? Because some years ago, it felt like the Chinese, maybe more like a decade ago, but the Chinese art scene seemed to explode, both in quantity, but also initiatives and different art forms and how to say, the consensus of art, so to speak.
Yeah, I'd say about 15, 20 years ago, perhaps more, there was an explosion in the Chinese contemporary art scene, which to some people heralded a kind of opening up of borders, commercially as well as physically, in the sense perhaps people were able to travel more. But to my mind, things have taken a little bit of a step backwards in the past few years, and people seem to face more restrictions than ever in mainland China. But I'm just taking this I'm basing this on friends and journalists based there. But I think it's become more authoritarian.
In your book, there is a chapter dedicated to the suppression of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender plus artists in illiberal democracies. Can you explain to us what are the tactics used by religious groups and governments to repress their individualities?
Yeah, perhaps it's worth defining what illiberal democracies are, first of all. I quote the late US diplomat Richard Holbrooke in my book. He defined these countries or these nations as democratically elected regimes, routinely ignoring constitutional limits on their power and depriving their citizens of basic rights and freedoms. In the book, I focus on LGBTQ art communities in Brazil, Turkey, and Poland. I spoke to a curator called Gaudencio Fidelis in Brazil. He is a very interesting man. He organized an exhibition called the Queer Museum, Cartographies of Difference in Brazilian Art, which opened at the Santander Cultural Institute in southern Brazil in 2017. The exhibition was closed down pretty quickly, actually, because protesters from a group called the Free Brazil Movement, it's a right-wing pressure group, accused the exhibition of promoting blasphemy, bestiality. So the exhibition closed pretty quickly. But it was that was a kind of turning point for Brazil's artistic community as such, if you see what I mean, because the country has lived through a military dictatorship. I think arts figures in the country were amazed to see censorship on that sort of scale again. And the situation was compounded by measures taken by now the former president, Jair Bolsonaro. When I spoke to the curator, Gaudencio Fidelis, he said the administration under Bolsonaro was intent on changing how the LGBTQ community was perceived in general. And he thinks the attack on his queer museum exhibition helped stoke a kind of underlying resentment towards minority groups. But I think what you have to remember with Brazil is that there are still groups ingrained in Brazilian society, such as evangelical Christians. So those sort of groups had a real... they were the ones most upset about the Queer Museum show, actually. And it was a clash of ideologies and value systems as such. Turkey, the other country I look at, that's a bit of a difficult one because I think generally artists have steered clear of criticising President Erdogan. The art scene there has continued to sort of buckle under a prolonged crackdown on free speech, actually. There are lots of journalists in prison in Turkey. There really are. It's quite dangerous place to be. And I last visited Turkey in 2019. I went to a new art centre called Arte in Istanbul, Contemporary Art Centre. And I spoke to lots of Turkish artists who seemed quite tired of discussing politics. I don't blame them. But many acknowledge that they sort of autocorrect their work. Some of them self-censor. And I found that very interesting because I think that's a mechanism for survival in a fairly authoritarian society. And the government in Turkey has clamped down on artists, LGBTQ artists, through a kind of massive anti-terrorism laws. They kind of date back to 1991, some of them. So after 2015, everything seemed to hinge more and more on quite this vague kind of terrorism legislation. So that it's become particularly murky in Turkey, so to speak. Excuse the... And Poland is very interesting because, of course, we know Poland is a member of the European Union. It transitioned to democracy after the fall of communism, 1989. But I think it's important to remember it remains a deeply conservative country in the shadow of the Catholic Church, you know.
Do you find the church has such an impact on the Polish art scene, or is that more like how the government, etc., are conservative? Or
the church does have an impact. I mean, I wrote in the book about an individual called Elizabeth Podlesna. She's an artist with two other activists. She put up, she placed images of the Virgin Mary with a rainbow halo around it, around the city of Plock in a few years ago. I think it was 2019, actually. In June 2020, the three were charged before a regional court, and the artist was detained. But I then watched a television interview with Elizabeth Podlesna, and she said that it's all about finding a scapegoat, and the church, as you asked, still has an important position in society. So, and then the government, the Polish government, you could argue it often plays a kind of family values card. It promised to introduce a raft of proposals to protect Polish people from LGBTQ plus ideology. That was a kind of strategy during the last general election in 2020 by the ruling party. So this heteronormative idea is often put forward by the right-wing government in Poland. That has a knock-on effect on the artists, as I've just described with Elizabeth Podlesna. So she was probably, that was one of the most famous censorship cases there in the past few years.
But what about, do you also mention Pussy Riot as one of those groups that has been very well, censored?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the situation in Russia is extremely complex post the war in Ukraine. Um, I don't know very much about Pussy Riot. I mean, they've been activists for a number of years now, haven't they? And they're living outside the country. So they're obviously very vocal in their anti-Putin protests. I suppose what's impressive about them is that they are completely, well, they're always determined to show opposition to the current regime in Moscow. Yeah, I mean, they've been particularly bold, actually. And I think that's particularly admirable, especially if been under threat that entire time. I did meet them a few years ago in Singapore, um, and they were fearless, and I was very impressed.
When it comes to the internet, AI and the online world, we talked about it a bit, but there seems to be a rise of policing by algorithms. Why do you think it is happening, and how do you believe it will evolve? I mean, I guess we're just in the start of this era, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, people aren't always aware that the most complex and fraught censorship battles are being fought on social media. In the past few years, I've reported on various artists who found themselves banned from platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. This is all down to a series of hugely powerful algorithms that determine whether certain images can be shown online. As I keep saying, many artists find these conditions frustrating. So, for example, the female nipple is banned across Instagram generally. Something called shadow banning is a big problem, which is something I can explain a little later on. It's when your sort of hashtags are deleted. It's difficult. I mean, the argument hasn't really developed, but the crux of the argument is that Instagram and its parent company, Facebook, basically both ban photographic representations of the naked body. And it's a long-running problem. It has developed. In 2018, Instagram revised its policy to allow artistic nudity in sculpture and painting. But even so, its community guidelines, its conditions remain ambiguous. When I was writing the book, I spoke to an artist called Savannah Spirit. Her imagery is often taken down from Instagram. She said, paintings, protest art, and drawings of nudes are okay, as well as pictures of women breastfeeding, but the nude in photography is still questionable. That debate is evolving a little, but not very much. I suppose what I should say is that in 2021, Adam Mosseri, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, he's the head of Instagram, or he was, said the platform doesn't have one algorithm that oversees what people do and don't see on the app. We use a variety of algorithms, classifiers, and processes, each with its own purposes. And then when I was writing the book, I got a source from Meta, which is now Facebook. It's called Meta now. Who said that while some people may disagree with where the company draws the line, there are several reasons why it does not allow nudity on Facebook and Instagram, all centered on safety and consent. This person said to me, we can't always guarantee the person in the image is over 18 or that they consented to having the image shared. We need clear rules so that our 15,000 plus content reviewers around the world, people reviewing the pictures, can apply our policies fairly and consistently. The only trouble with all of this is artists rely more and more on social media platforms for income, for a commercial they rely on it for money, as a commercial income generator. So some of the artists I spoke to were incredibly frustrated that they were losing out, both commercially, their profile, and it just rumbles on. There's a group called Don't Delete Art, which is a campaign group protesting against censorship online. And that's, I think, released a manifesto last week. So, yeah, what I find very worrying is that the situation doesn't seem to be getting any better. So at some point, those social media platforms are going to have to sit down again with artists. In 2019, I think there was a big meeting between artists and Facebook and Instagram. That's going to happen again, because the situation is not being resolved in any way, shape or form, which is a shame.
But is it different from country to country, or is it the same globally?
Yes, that's the issue, isn't it? About whether you enforce different rules in different areas geographically. But obviously there are different sensitivities worldwide, aren't there? You know, people in the Middle East obviously follow a different kind of value system to people in Europe. But I find it quite hard to believe that social media companies cannot even begin to process why artists are angry. And there must be some sort of coding element that allows them to adapt their platforms around the world. I don't know. I don't know very much about coding or social media. I don't put these platforms together, but it's very difficult. I did have a really good comment, or I did talk to a really interesting... Yeah, when I spoke to Meta about this and different sensitivities around the world, they emphasized that basically everyone needs to be aware of the fact that different people and different communities around the world have different sensitivities to nudity. So I guess they want their followers to keep that in mind. But obviously that's a very complex operation. I don't know.
Yeah, it must be very hard also to have a system that fits all, doesn't it?
Yeah, you could argue that perhaps very strict censorship rules make it much easier for social media platforms to make inroads into socially conservative countries across the Middle East and Asia. Perhaps that's the point as well, isn't it? If they want to kind of increase their market share, I guess they need to respect the values of different nations and countries worldwide. Perhaps there's a business aspect to it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the strategies of social media companies are. You might know better than me.
But yeah, but also I'm thinking if this is a situation for a lot of artists, I guess the only way to reach out is to change their motive and their creativity. So how does censorship affect the creativity, in your opinion?
Well, that's a really vast question, isn't it? On the most basic level, artists obviously feel cowed as such if they think they might end up in jail. You know, in a country like Cuba, if you kind of perhaps depict anything remotely political, you're at risk of being thrown in prison. So I don't know. There's a counter argument, of course, that going underground or producing works that will not be freely available can fuel creativity even more. But I guess you're asking also whether artists should just stop doing what they do and creating what they want to create. Is that what you mean, in the sense that governments set rules? But that's extremely difficult, isn't it? I don't know. That leads you into the area of self-censorship then, which is something that's particularly problematic, because I would have said no artist wants to self-censor or autocorrect. So I don't know if people manage to find certain outlets or platforms and find an audience. Perhaps, that's the key thing, finding the right audience at the right time. You're more fortunate if you live in Europe, although censorship exists in Europe. It's very, very difficult.
And obviously this is a very interesting book, but as I see it, it's kind of, as you mentioned, things has happened since you just wrote the book, and this was just a year ago. So I think we will see a development of this, of course, and I'm quite sure that you will make a part 2 in a soon future about this topic, because unfortunately, there is a reason, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to do a follow-up book on ethical issues in the art world, which ties into censorship. And I think that there's a lot to be said about other things, other ethical areas. Who funds museums? Where do people choose to work? Should they work in authoritarian regimes? You mentioned AI art, artificial intelligence art, which is becoming a huge issue in the art world. Artists are worried about losing work to AI generating machines, which sounds, at this point in time, I mean, is it GPT? Have I said that right? I can't remember the name. That's brought into the issue. That's also brought to the forefront the issue of how artists make art as well. And I think at the moment we are at a very interesting tipping point with regards to artificial intelligence. That's another debate, which I would like to follow up in a second book. But who knows? Interesting times.
It is for sure. So, Gareth, I think time is running out, but thank you so much for joining the pod, Gareth, and I'm sure we will have you back for the second part then.
Thank you so much, Pontus. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to express my views.
To keep up with the latest trends and receive weekly updates on the art and auction world, subscribe to our newsletter on barnabys.com or read Barnabys magazine online.